welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, if you haven't done so already. You can also find a full archive of previous episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. Nigeria's ongoing battle with the violent extremist group Boko Haram took a worrying turn last month when more than 300 young schoolboys were abducted from their boarding school in Katsina state in northwestern Nigeria. Thankfully, the students were freed and reunited with their families a week later, but the attack carried chilling echoes of another mass abduction from 2014 when 276 female students were kidnapped from their school in the northeastern town of Chibok. More than 100 of those girls are still missing. While Boko Haram has taken credit for last month's raid in Katsina, experts and Nigerian officials say the true culprits were local criminal gangs that have formed alliances with Boko Haram, which appears to be using them to expand its reach beyond its traditional base in the country's northeast. And the group has carried out a number of violent attacks in recent weeks, including a deadly assault on a mostly Christian village in Borno State on Christmas Eve, where at least 11 people were killed and a church was burned down. Joining me now to discuss the security crisis in Nigeria and the government's response is Bulama Bukarti. He's an analyst at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change and a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He's a world-renowned expert on violent extremist groups in sub-Saharan Africa, and he also has years of experience working as a lawyer in his native Nigeria. Bulama, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you very much for having me. Really grateful for this opportunity.
It's really great to have you here. I thought we could start by just asking you to paint a quick and dirty picture for us of what Boko Haram is, what its motivations are, its ideology, and its capacity.
So Boko Haram was founded in early 2003 by a man called Muhammad Yusuf, who saw the September 11th attack on the United States as a great victory over the enemies of Islam and was inspired by that attack to start a group in Nigeria with similar objectives and tactics. And that was how he went on to found Boko Haram in 2003. He recruited young people using religious narratives in the northeastern part of Nigeria mainly, and then started a war in 2009 in which he was killed. And his deputy, Shekau, who now sits with $7 million American bounty on his head, became the leader of the group and continued to pursue their insurgency in northeastern Nigeria, but also parts of Cameroon and Chad and Niger, where they have killed 40,000 people, an estimated 40,000 people in the last 10 years, displaced 2.5 million people, and have plunged over 7 million others into their humanitarian needs, including women and children. The group now has an estimated 5,000 to 7,000 fighters, and they continue to pursue their horrific campaign, whose objective, they say, is to get rid of Western institutions and influence from their domain and install an Islamic, if you like, and install their own version of the Sharia, of 7th century Sharia law.
So as we were talking a little bit before we started recording, the group has faced some setbacks at the hands of the Nigerian army and the multinational task force that's in place to combat the insurgency. But it's bounced back over the past couple of years. So what accounts for that resurgence?
Yes, you are right. It did suffer some losses at the hands of the Nigerian army and the multinational joint task force in 2015 and 2016, even into 2017. And let's just take a step back because in 2000, after when the group started its insurgency, it reached its peak around 2013, 2014, when it captured Nigerian territory the size of Belgium and declared the establishment of an Islamic caliphate. It later pledged allegiance to ISIS's leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was killed. And so it continued to claim that a caliphate has been built in West Africa. Now, in 2015, when the current president of Nigeria took the mantle of leadership, he made some changes, including the reinvigoration of the Multinational Joint Task Force, which is a military unit consisting of soldiers from Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, Chad, and Benin, and also made some changes at the leadership of the military in Nigeria. And that positioned the Nigerian army and the Multinational Joint Task Force to deal some blows on Boko Haram and dislodge the group from the caliphate it said it had declared and pushed it into the fringes of the Lake Chad region. Now, from 2018 or so, we saw the group bouncing back. And there are several factors responsible for that. There are both internal and external factors. I would just mention three internal factors and look at three external factors in the interest of time. The first is the fact that the group has been able to develop resilience. You know, every year in this kind of guerrilla warfare is additional experience, additional sophistication on the part of the group. And that's why I would say the first year is the worst year for any insurgency or insurgent group, because they gain more experience with the passage of time. And what we have seen is a more resilient, more sophisticated group from 2018. The second is continued access to fighters and supplies. For me, an insurgency is like an overflowing bath. When your bath overflows, the first thing you want to do is to stop the tap from running before you start evacuating the water. But if you continue to evacuate the water while the tap keeps running, then you will never succeed you would never succeed. And that's what we see with Boko Haram. Governments continue to fight the group's fighters. They continue to say they are succeeding against the group, but the group is able to recruit more young people, mostly through conscription, mostly through recruitment by force, and it continues to get essential supply even though it is in the bush. And therefore that allows it to continue to wreak havoc in the part of the countries we are talking about. And then finally, its fragmentation in 2016. This may be weird because the logical thing is when a group splits, we would think the group will get weakened. But there are great studies in terrorism showing that fragmentation of jihadi groups could help them in becoming more sophisticated and more lethal, and in also their longevity. And that's because of a process called outbidding, where you have both factions of the group trying tactical experimentations in different ways in order to outperform the other. And what we have seen from 2016 when Boko Haram splintered into two was a continued competition between the two groups, each trying to be more lethal than the other, in the process of which they are now becoming more deadly. Now, these are the three factors internally, but there are external factors which I will just run through quickly. The first is the weakening of the Multinational Joint Task Force, which I said consists of militaries from Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, Chad, and Benin. From 2018, we saw growing reluctance on the part of the Chadian army to continue this cooperation. And the Chadian army had been very effective in the fight against Boko Haram. In 2018, in October of 2018, they announced their withdrawal, the withdrawal of the 12,000 Chadian troops fighting on Nigerian soil, saying their mission has expired and the Nigerian government did not renew the mission. And that withdrawal was completed in January of 2019. We warned at that time that a vacuum was going to be created and Boko Haram was going to exploit that vacuum. And that was exactly what happened. And in March last year, Boko Haram launched its deadliest attack in Chad and killed 100 Chadian soldiers. And what we saw immediately after that was a complaint by the Chadian president himself, Idris Deby, saying other countries do not pay their fair share in the cooperation, and therefore he would stop fighting Boko Haram from outside his borders. He later backtracked that statement, but we know that the coalition has weakened, especially because it is headquartered in Chad. And so the country hosting the headquarters is saying we would not continue to be as committed as we were. And what we saw immediately after that was a celebratory editorial by ISIS's magazine celebrating the weakening of the multinational joint task force as a success for Boko Haram and its and ISIS allies in West Africa. The second factor is lack of sufficient weapons and equipment, especially on the part of the Nigerian army. We have seen several complaints, some of them publicly by the army fighting on the ground, that they are outpowered and outweaponed by Boko Haram and that they are suffering from lack of manpower. The final is the geography of the area itself, because Boko Haram operates in a border region that brings 4 different countries together: Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, and Chad. And it is a forest that is also mountainous and has a body of water. So it's a very difficult terrain, especially for the army with their heavy military equipment. And Boko Haram continues to exploit that geography and the porous border between the countries. And therefore, what you typically see is when there is an onslaught by one country, say Nigeria, what Boko Haram fighters simply do is to slip into the territory of another country. And by international law, the Nigerian army cannot pursue them into the territory of Cameroon, for example, or Niger, and fight them there. And therefore, you continue to play this game of hide and seek with them, and that's something that has helped Boko Haram's resilience.
One of the elements you mentioned, I think, is really fascinating. The idea that Boko Haram splintering into factions would make those factions more competitive and more deadly through that outbidding process that you talked about. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit, because I think it's a little bit counterintuitive. Generally, when we think about an organization splintering into factions, we think of that resulting in a weakening of the group. But what you're talking about is the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, it's the opposite I am talking about. And this is not just something unique to Boko Haram. When ISIS splintered from Al Qaeda, we thought both groups would weaken. But what we saw immediately after the splintering was ISIS conquering territories, capturing territories, and declaring the establishment of a caliphate. And we can see that both ISIS and Al Qaeda continue to be deadly, though one is deadlier than the other. So, what happens typically is when you have groups splintering, they become adversaries. They become rivals of each other. And so what they typically do is to compete, and their competition is in getting more sophisticated, getting deadlier, in launching more deadly attacks and capturing media attention. So what we saw after Boko Haram splintered was one of the groups recognized by ISIS calling itself Islamic State West Africa Province, the other an independent group under its leader Abu Bakr Shekau, who has 7 million American bounty on his head. And so what they kept doing, and we saw this even during this Christmas, the 2020 Christmas, we saw both groups competing to attack communities with large Christian population so that they could get media attention on Christmas Day. We also saw both groups launching audacious attacks on the Nigerian military and militaries of other countries, just to capture media attention and to show that they are the most powerful. They are in control of the jungle. Of course, there were factional fights between them, but that didn't stop them. And this is well explained in the literature, that this kind of process, this process of competition, this process of trying to outbid one another, can actually help the groups in getting more sophisticated and in their longevity. And like I said, we saw that in Nigeria, but also in the Sahel, where you now have ISIS affiliates and Al Qaeda affiliates competing with one another to kill French troops, to control populations, and to control territory.
How do you assess the Nigerian government's response to the recent kidnapping in Katsina State of the 340 schoolboys and their subsequent release? Were there some lessons learned from the kidnapping in Chibok 6 years ago that the government was able to use here?
I think it's a great question. We might need to just take a step in the interest of the audience. The Chibok kidnapping was an abduction carried out by Boko Haram in April of 2014, where they abducted 276 schoolgirls from their school dormitory in northeastern Nigeria. And unfortunately, what we saw after that was forced conversion of the girls, most of whom were Christians, into Boko Haram's version of Islam, but also forcefully marrying them up to Boko Haram commanders. And 6 years on, there are over 100 of the girls still in custody. And even the 100 and or so, even the 102 that were later liberated from the group were only freed after money was paid to the group. Ransom was paid to the group by the Nigerian government reportedly, and after they had gone through years of sexual and domestic slavery. Now, the recent kidnapping happened on the 11th of December when about 300 boys, over 300 boys, if you like, were abducted also from their school dormitory, this time in northwestern Nigeria. And there was lots of confusion as to who was responsible for the kidnapping, because that's a part of Nigeria where criminal bandits have been operating for 10 years. They have killed 8,000 people in the last 10 years and have kidnapped thousands of people and have extorted millions of dollars in ransom. Now, some versions said they were kidnapped by those bandits, those local criminals called bandits. Others said it could be Boko Haram. And then the next thing we saw 2-3 days after the attack was a claim of responsibility by Boko Haram's leader. And then they later released a video, a footage of the boys in the bush. But then, astonishingly, the boys were released hours after the video was released of them by Boko Haram. Now, there was then this debate as to whether they were kidnapped by Boko Haram or by bandits. What most people don't realize is that I have been flagging this for 12 months now, that Boko Haram had been making efforts to infiltrate the criminal bandits in the northwestern part of Nigeria and to recruit them into the group. And that's a very dangerous scenario, and I will talk about that later. And it had succeeded in recruiting at least some elements of the bandits. So what happened was local criminal groups that had developed a link with Boko Haram kidnapped the boys, and then they later released them after negotiations with the Nigerian government, especially at the state level. Now, I would say a big lesson had been learned from the Chibok kidnapping. When the Chibok incident happened, what we saw from the part of the federal government was denial. It took more than 3 weeks of advocacy and international outrage for the Nigerian government even to acknowledge that the incident did happen. And that 3-week period allowed Boko Haram to take the girls into the heart of the bush and to divide them into smaller groups, and therefore made their rescue impossible. Now, in this case, in the case of the recent one, we saw the government acknowledging that the incident did happen the following morning and deploying the military to pursue the kidnappers. And what they did was, because they had this head start, they were able to surround them and make it impossible for them to take the boys out of the region from where they took them. And that gave the government a bargaining power, if you like. But at the end of the day, they were released by the group after what the government called a negotiation with the group. They say they did not pay a ransom, even though there are some media reports that a ransom had been paid. But then whatever happened, the most important thing I think now is that the boys have been rescued, unlike the Chibok girls, over 100 of whom are still in Boko Haram's brutal custody. But I think there should be a wider concern, because if Boko Haram consolidates its presence in that part of the country, then it is a testimony of a group that is expanding, and that's very dangerous. Even in its heydays, Boko Haram had never had a cell in the northwestern part of Nigeria. The northwestern part of Nigeria is over 400 miles from Boko Haram's epicenter in the northeast. So if the group consolidates itself in the northwest, that means it has succeeded in extending its caliphate. It can give moral justification to those criminal groups that have been killing people for 10 years by framing their criminality as a jihad approved by Islam and their criminal gangs as booty of war permitted by God. And so that will make them more vicious, but also allow them to recruit more people. And I think the government of Nigeria should move fast to disrupt this link and to ensure that Boko Haram doesn't consolidate its presence in the northwest.
This question of Boko Haram's resurgence, in my mind, raises the question of what exactly the group's revenue streams are and how they're able to arm themselves. You mentioned that they often outgun the Nigerian army. So how are they able to get these advanced weapons and enough money to keep themselves operating and to expand, as you said?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky area. We know that these groups are clandestine in nature and they are very secretive. But we have done extensive research into this area and have been able to discover some of their streams of income, part of which is the kidnapping I spoke about earlier, from which they have made millions. It's not only kidnapping Nigerians, but also Western citizens, French citizens, British citizens. And there are reports that in some of those incidents, they have been paid millions of euros or pounds to release their victims, but also kidnapping locals. In the case of the Chibok girls, some media reports say $3 million. Some media reports say $3 million was paid to the group. They kidnapped university teachers on oil exploration in the north east in 2018, and some 10 police women. And some media reports say about $2 million was paid to them. They also are engaged in rustling cows. They have rustled over 30,000 heads of cows from Cameroon and Nigeria, and they sell those in the market and make money. They are engaged in fishing and taxing locals. Taxation is a big part of their revenue stream, especially by fishermen and farmers whose business have been outlawed by the government because of the criminal activities of the group. Because governments say the groups are engaged in fishing, and therefore, instead of ensuring they don't engage in fishing, governments outlawed fishing. And that made thousands of fishermen who earn a livelihood from fishing desperate. So what they did was to to conspire with the group, so the group would give them access to the water it controls uh, in exchange of payment of some money. So these are some of the group's revenue stream. But they are also very good at looting weapons from the state troops fighting them. And that's why you see them wearing military uniforms, using military vehicles and military weapons. And remember that the group is active in Niger, and Niger shares a border with Libya, where the fall of the Gaddafi regime has made light and small weapons very common in that part of the world. And therefore, it is very easy to smuggle weapons from Libya into Niger and then into the northeastern part of Nigeria and other parts of the countries where Boko Haram is present. So it's a bit complicated, but it's a combination of ransom payments, cattle rustling, and smuggling of weapons.
And taxation.
Yes, and taxation of locals. And taxation is a very big part of their weapons. For example, even the Nigerian army acknowledges that fishing is one of the group's major income streams. But there could also be some international transfer. So, for example, we know that in 2010, the group got at least 200,000 euros from Al Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb. And we recently also saw 6 Nigerians convicted in the United Arab Emirates for transferring money to Boko Haram. And they transferred over $800,000 to the group, allegedly from someone who flies in from Turkey into Abu Dhabi, gives them the money in cash, and then they transfer to Boko Haram's agents in Nigeria. And these are areas governments fighting Boko Haram and their partners have to pay attention to. Because, like I said in the beginning, unless their finance and supply sources are blocked, you can't defeat them. If they continue to be able to recruit young people, if they continue to get supplies, if they continue to get money, there is no way to defeat them.
I suppose that those revenue streams are sort of analogous to the water flowing into the bathtub, to use that metaphor that you mentioned earlier. You can't just be scooping water out. You have to stop the flow of the water in.
Exactly. Scooping the water when the tap continues to run wouldn't solve the problem. So the first thing is to stop the tap from running, and that is stopping the revenue streams, stopping the group from being able to conscript young people, stopping them from getting supplies, essential supplies like food supplies. Of course, we know that they are engaged in agriculture because the area, the territory they occupy is fertile for agriculture. But there are essential things they can't farm, they can't cultivate themselves. What they do typically is to smuggle them into their territory from outside the territory. And so you have got to block those routes before you can solve the problem. And that's, like you said, stopping the tap and then scooping the water.
You mentioned earlier the expansion of the group through these alliances they formed with local gangs in the northwest of the country. What implications does that have for the efforts of the Nigerian army and the multinational task force to combat the group? Is there a change in tactics or strategy that necessitates?
Yeah, so as I hinted initially, it is a very dangerous scenario now playing out. These are criminal groups that have been killing people, robbing them without any moral justification. They knowing that they are criminals. Now Boko Haram is coming to tell them what you are doing isn't criminal. In fact, it is approved by God. That will make them more vicious. It will give them an opportunity to recruit more young people. And also, Boko Haram could help those groups, can fast track those groups' sophistication and professionalization. So, for example, we know that Boko Haram has been producing improvised explosives for more than 5 years now. They can easily teach those groups manufacturing those explosives. And if governments don't move fast, I worry that we might see bombings in the northwest in the coming month. Now, on Boko Haram's part, these groups could be additional source of revenue stream for them because the northwestern part of Nigeria is rich in cattle and agriculture, but also rich in gold. And the gold mining industry there is unregulated, essentially. So what you might see is Boko Haram tapping into the agriculture and gold mining industries in the northwest to get more money and stock more weapons and supplies. Now, in terms of what its broader implication, the northwest is the area now standing between the northeastern part of Nigeria where Boko Haram is active and the Sahel where powerful Al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliates are operating. And if Boko Haram consolidates its presence in the northwest, then it could become a land bridge between the Sahel and the Lake Chad region. And so fighters can freely move, arms can be freely moved and also loot. And so it is also a transnational issue. And the northwestern part of Nigeria has already started becoming a transnational issue because about 2 months ago, an American citizen was abducted in Niger, but he was rescued in the northwestern part of Nigeria. And all the reports we have say he was abducted by criminal gangs, showing that criminal gangs are now able to operate transnationally. So I think it's a question of the Nigerian government strengthening its military response to the criminal gangs by acknowledging that it is now more than just an anti-criminality operation, it has moved into an anti-insurgency or anti-terror operation. To move into an anti-terror or anti-insurgency operation in the Northwest, but also establish military and intelligence cooperation with Niger Republic in order to ensure that the groups are defeated. But I think Western governments, including the American government, need to also update their policy, because the current policy sees Sahel as a different theater from the Lake Chad region. And with Boko Haram's inroads into the Northwest, you can say the lines are now getting blurred. And I think we must recognize that you cannot defeat groups in the Sahel without defeating groups in the Lake Chad region. And the reverse is also the case. So I think what you need is a holistic approach, holistic localized approach, if you like, that looks at both the Lake Chad and the Sahel as related crisis zones and approaches the issues holistically.
What is your read on the extent to which the incoming administration of President-elect Joe Biden sees this issue as a top priority? And do you think that he and his advisors will be able to get a handle on the problem holistically, as you just mentioned?
I think it is vital that the US continues to engage with Africa and continues to help Africa in the fight against terrorism, not only because of the moral imperatives, but also because of geopolitical issues. For example, we know that Russia and China are making inroads into Africa, including West Africa, not only in terms of trade, but also politically. And that could have implications for American leadership in the medium and the long run. So I think for the geopolitics, but also the third thing is the fact that these groups have always been vocal about their hatred for America and its values. We know that they currently do not constitute a threat to the US, but if they continue to consolidate in Africa, they could constitute a threat to the West. And if there is anywhere ISIS could replicate its territorial achievements, that's their territorial achievement in Iraq and Syria, that's West Africa. It has all the signs that made, for example, Afghanistan a hotbed for terrorism. And I think for these reasons, it is important for the American government to continue to engage. And coming to the Biden administration, his success in the election was something that was welcomed across Africa, not only by the government but also by the citizens of by Africans, and that's because Africans have high expectations of the Biden administration because they see it as a credible restart to the Trumpian foreign policy that saw American diplomatic influence waning in the world, including in Africa. And I think it is good for the Biden administration to keep up to that expectation by continuing the cooperative links with the continent, which was started or pursued by the Obama administration. And I think that could be done by refocusing U.S. policy on Africa and repairing the relationship that soured under the Trump administration. So, for example, with Nigeria, we know that there were incidents that soured the relationship between Nigeria and the US. For example, when the Nigerian president met President Trump in the White House, reports came out in 2018 of how President Trump made unfavorable comments about the Nigerian president, calling him a lifeless person and saying he doesn't want to meet him again. The Trump administration added the Nigeria to its visa ban list, and then we saw how they continued to withdraw. They had a policy of withdrawing troops from Africa, including from West Africa, and I think these are things the Biden administration should work to repair. And I think the best way to do that is to go back to the traditional American soft policy, which recognizes the importance of military efforts, but also makes soft approach an important area. And I think the Biden administration could do that in Nigeria by engaging with religious and community leaders, by establishing ties with religious and community leaders, with women and youth groups, with the media and civil society organizations. That's not something we have seen under the Trump presidency, and it is something the Biden administration, I think, should pursue. But this cannot be possible without decentralizing diplomacy in Nigeria. At the moment, there is a big US embassy in Abuja and there is a big US consulate in Lagos. But you can't deal with the whole of Nigeria, a country of 200 million people, from Abuja and Lagos. I think there is need for decentralization, for some form of soft American presence through US aid and other agencies in other parts of the country, and pursue more soft diplomacy to ensure that ties are established with some of the most influential Nigerians at the grassroots. There is need for establishing ties with community leaders, traditional leaders, youth and women groups, with the Nigerian people rather than just with the Nigerian government.
This is something that John Campbell, a former U.S. ambassador to Nigeria, has talked about and has written for WPR about, actually, broadening the reach of U.S. diplomats and making sure those people-to-people connections, as they call it at the State Department, are really strengthened.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And maybe the final thing around the military cooperation, I think the Biden administration should avoid the temptation of heavy American presence on the ground, military presence. I think the best approach is through building local capacity, local security capacity, through security sector and defense sector reforms, but also building local governance capacity with in African countries. I think one thing they should try to avoid, for example, the approach we saw in Somalia, which hasn't been productive. We know that the Trump administration has surged American airstrikes in Somalia against Al Shabaab, and what we saw there was heavy civilian damage, not only in terms of civilian property and casualty, but also in terms of civilian land damage, to the extent that some areas of Somalia cannot farm in their own farmlands because of American airstrikes. And that led to pockets of protests in Somalia, anti-American protests, even though that did not escalate to a national level. But we know that that's damaging to uh, American soft power. And we know that the Trump administration has completed 100 million drone base in Niger, where 4 American soldiers died in October of 2017. And the plan could be airstrikes in the Sahel and perhaps in the Lake Chad region. And I can tell you, we know that that hasn't been effective in other places of the world, including in Somalia, and that will continue to damage American standing in the world. I think the best way, like I said, is for is training local, is building local capacity, helping with uh, logistic and technical support, rather than heavy military or drone presence on ground.
Quickly, before we wrap up, I want to ask you about some of the past allegations of human rights abuses and atrocities that have been committed by Nigerian security forces in their counterinsurgency efforts. Do you think there's been enough done to address that and to make the army and security apparatus in Nigeria more accountable?
No, unfortunately. And you are right that there have been instances of allegations of human rights violations that could rise to the level of war crimes or crime against humanity on the part of the Nigerian army. And like I said, these are instances, but not only the Nigerian army, also Cameroon and other countries. Not enough has been done in that angle because we have not seen any soldier being tried for any serious crime against civilians in that part of the world. the International Criminal Court has been investigating, and it announced last December that it had concluded its preliminary investigation and believes that the vast majority of war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed by Boko Haram, but that there are also instances committed by state forces in Nigeria and other countries. And it indicated that it was going to start a full-fledged investigation. But that investigation was too slow because it took a decade to complete the preliminary investigation. Now one would wonder how long will it take to complete a formal, full-fledged investigation if it took you 10 years to complete the preliminary investigation. And in Nigeria, nobody had been held accountable. And some of those some of those allegations could be credible. I think the international community needs to do more. The International Criminal Court, but also the US government put more pressure, diplomatic pressure on Nigeria and other countries on American core values, the values of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And I think that's something the Biden administration has indicated it was going to do, because in the wake of the NSAS protests, there were accusations that the Nigerian army cracked down on protesters and killed innocent protesters. And we saw a tweet from President-elect Biden, who was a candidate then, condemning the act and saying America was not going to condone. And I think the administration should follow up on that kind of posture and ensure that not only Nigeria, but other African countries live up to their human rights commitments and their commitment to democracy and the rule of law. And I think that's an important part. And that's why what I think when it comes to aid and investment is some sort of pact between receiving governments and Western governments that give those kinds of aids. And those pacts should clearly spell the duties and obligations of the host countries, of the receiving countries like Nigeria, and should clearly spell indicators that would be the preconditions for aid to continue to go to places like Nigeria. Otherwise, we might not get to where we want to get to.
Bulama, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bulama Bukarti is an analyst at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, where he specializes in violent extremist groups of sub-Saharan Africa. He's also a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. Go ahead and follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman with 2 L's and 1 T, and Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.